Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth and final lecture in Chapter 4. This one, we're going to take a look at federalism and politics. So, how our government operates in the federalist system with politics involved. And it's a doozy at times, I'll tell you. So, let's get into it. All right, so the biggest issue in terms of federalism and politics being conjoined is term limits. And basically, the question is, do you believe that government officials should have term limits? Why? And if you do, why? If you don't, why? And also with that, do you think term limits should exist at every level, from the local forms of government all the way up to the highest forms of our federal government, such as the president or Supreme Court or Congress? And why? So which ones? Some of you are going to believe that it's only at certain levels or certain positions, whereas others are going to believe it should be at all. So this is a big question, and we're going to take a look at this afterwards in class. Now, let's get into public policy. So policy is a stated course of action. It's all right, this is what you're going to do, and this is where we're going to go. So basically, government, when we're talking about government and policy, that means public policy, because when you have the idea of anything, when you're talking about government or economics and you see the word public, it means government. Now, how is policy affected by federalism? Well, it's affected in two ways. It's affected in how and where policies are actually made, whether it's at the state or local or federal government. And it's also affected by, in terms of the introduction of limits on policy making at any of the levels. Now, there are new policies that have developed over time, and these are some terms that you guys had for vocab, and they're pretty easy to remember. They're the sunset laws and sunshine laws. And basically, one's opening things up and one's closing or ending things. So sunset laws, they're basically set, they come out and say, look, at certain amounts of time, whether it's every year, every couple of years, whatever, there are checks into all of the different agencies and programs, and they review them and see if they're still needed. If they're needed, then they're kept, or at least passed along to talk about, and if they're not, then they're taken down, or they're going to be closed or phased out. Sunshine laws prohibit any public officials or public meetings from being closed. So basically, this is important so that if people want to go to a public meeting, they can, and they can see what's being talked about or voice their opinion. Best example I can give you guys, and I would write this down, is a school board meeting. You can go to a school board meeting and you can voice your opinion. Sometimes they'll have closed door ones, but for the most part, because of sunshine laws, they can't. All right, now, let's talk about political parties. We have rival parties, and rival parties are a key to any element of any democracy. They're a key element. And even though they're not necessarily working right now in the best interests of the entire country, at least in certain points and at certain times. Now, this is an important part right here. The rival parties, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans or any number of third parties, because of federalism, you are actually able to win at every single level, even if you lose at one of the levels. So you can lose in the local level, but still possess power at the state level, or still possess power at the national level. And why is this important? Well, it's important for a couple of reasons. One, it's important because it allows participation to stay there, and it allows people that might lose in one area but win in a greater scale or a lesser scale be still involved, but it keeps the parties themselves fighting for control, which in essence, if they're actually working together once they've decided the elections, is a good thing. And then the other reason why it's important is because if you lose in one area, you still feel like you have your voice being heard in another. And this is where we see, like, for example, right now, you have the presidency is controlled by a Republican. The Senate's controlled by the Republicans slightly, but the House of Representatives is controlled by the Democrats. So even though you have some wins and losses, there's still there's still positions there for both parties. We're not even going to deal with this. Don't worry about that. We're going to move on, okay? All right, so participation. This is important because participating in government is what helps make it function. And we've seen participation lag in certain areas, which has affected our country. And one of the biggest instances coming up in terms of participation is on voting, because it's a presidential election. And then the fact that you have all these issues with mail-in balloting and maybe not being able to get to the polls, or, stuffing of boxes, all these different issues. And this especially being a very, very hotly contested election between Trump and Biden, participation is at the forefront. It's a big part of this election and the issues facing our government. So the effects of federalism on participation are that it's a positive generally, since you have shared power between the national government and state governments, and you have what we just talked about, where people can win at every single level. Even if they lose at another level or don't get the candidate that they want, it leads to participation to be more likely at all levels. And typically, and this is also a test question, generally your road to national office, so whether it's Congress or the Supreme Court or the presidency, generally that starts at the local and or state offices. And generally this is important because this preserves the parties from the bottom up. Basically, it's preserving the Republican or Democratic Party or third parties by gaining your experience at the lower levels and then working your way up the ladder. And then you become you might go from a local representative to a state representative to a national representative for your state, all the way to the presidency or something like that. Now, generally that does take place. That is the case, but we have had presidents, most notably our current one, or for example, Ulysses S. Grant, becoming president, that didn't start at the local or state level, and they started in national office. That has happened and will continue to happen at various times. Now, the opportunities for people to work at the local level all the way up are generally what you see on screen, at least starting. First is voting for officials. Your participation in voting is important, and then also voting on issues. And we're going to see that here in the upcoming weeks in the election here. You vote for the officials, you vote for the issues. And then also you can petition the government as a form of participation and opportunity to get into government if you choose to do so, or just participating in the actual action of what's going on. And then interest groups can work to influence policies as well. Now, increased success is important because the greater success you have, generally the more impact your political party is going to have. That's obvious. And federalism is actually granted greater chances of success for the political parties, and this leads to greater practical impact for them. So this is one of the most important of two effects of federalism. And you have to think about the question that there is on screen. What are the public benefits of increased success for a party or person politically? Why is that an important thing? Or what benefits can you see if you have increased success? Now, professional politicians. This is something that we need to talk about because professional politicians haven't really been a thing except for in the last 60, 70 years. Prior to that, politicians themselves would actually hold different jobs and different positions outside of just being a politician, such as a senator or representative. But that's changed because of how our government's expanded. It's changed because of technology. It's changed because of the world. But anyways, basically talking about this within policy, public policy started to get initiated by people in government increasingly in the 1960s. And since then, this has been increasing as well. So when you take that increase in public policy being initiated by people in government with the added number of increased programs since the 1930s because of President Roosevelt's New Deal, you have a larger bureaucracy. You have a larger group of people and a larger network to have the government function. And what this has done has created and made our government what's known as a tenocracy. And basically, what that means is that you have technical experience at your levels of government. We've essentially created people that have experience at all levels, which is a good thing in most cases, is that you have people that are very, very qualified, or at least understanding and used to that position and how things work. Now, as more programs have developed, there's been a closer relationship between the national government and lower offices, whether it's at the state or local positions, because you have programs that are dealing with certain things that the national government may be like, hey, you need to deal with this, such as water purity or parks or education, and these different programs have helped, and they've grown together at all levels. Now, this is also kind of what's happened too, is you've had this growing bureaucracy that this political cartoon's making fun of. And if you look at the names on the doors, it's kind of created this convoluted and complicated system of government in certain cases, where it may take too much time or slow things down because you have so many different levels of bureaucracy, which can be a negative. But it also can be a positive in that things are organized and you can actually spread things out and get more things done. But again, that's only if the parties specifically are working together. And unfortunately, that's not happening. And the problem of what you see on this political cartoon is becoming more realistic and happening more often. But if you look at the titles, it says Chairman of the Task Force to Reduce Government Bureaucracy. So basically the chairman to reduce the number of positions, and then you have vice chairman and assistant vice chairman and so forth, which is they're basically doing the opposite of what that position or task force is supposed to do in that political cartoon. Now, next, you also have to look at the states themselves, because the states in federalism and policy bring the differences. And federalism deals with, from a state standpoint, we have real economic and political difference between the states. So you have to look at it and say, for example, look at Michigan and compare it with any other state, such as Ohio or California or Hawaii or Arkansas. And basically you take that, and then you take the understanding of the fact that in federalism, the national governments and state governments are split their powers and are supposed to work together. But the national government reigns supreme. You see that the states have their own freedoms in arranging their own internal affairs. And I'll give you some examples. One, you could kind of see it within the COVID-19 response, primarily because, well, I mean, it wasn't entirely left up to the states, or that shouldn't have been, but it was because of a lack of equipment in the early days of it. It was also because the national government under our president said, look, you're going to basically do this, even though they had a task force to help nationally. He basically left it up to the states. And again, that's into the purview of federalism and how it's actually dealt with, whether you support that or don't. But the differences that we see here in federalism from a state standpoint is they're wide ranging. There's so many different ones depending on which state you're talking about. And you see basically why people or businesses choose to go to a certain place are because of these differences in federalism. So, for example, if you haven't figured it out, in the state of Michigan, cars, the automobile industry, is a huge part of this state. And it's an example of how federalism has affected our state by arranging our own affairs, such as the auto industry or dealing with roads or what have you. All right, so let's talk about the direction where we're going in the future. The oldest debate in this issue of federalism is, what is the proper division of powers between the national government and the state governments? Now, tendency across our actions in all of our history tends to favor the national government, and power balances itself out and changes as new issues arise and new periods of history are going on. Whereas like we look at in the years before the Civil War, you had more people that viewed the states' rights position, whereas in, let's say, the Great Depression, you had more people that viewed the nationalist position or what have you. And this has actually lent itself out in our political parties as well, is where Democrats typically believe in a nationalist position, so that the national government should control everything and should deal with, what's going on, whereas Republicans tend to deal with or view the states' rights position is more correct, and that the states should handle the spending or handle more of the actions that are going on. Now, obviously, this isn't necessarily true for all Democrats or all Republicans, but this is where they kind of tend to lean. All right, guys, that's all I got for you here to finish up Chapter 4. Remember, as always, when you study for the test, complete that study guide before class and before the review session, the day before the test. Make sure you complete the guided reading for Chapter 4 and study for that chapter test, 4 tests coming up here shortly. Review these lectures. They're good for you. They'll help you a lot. Have a good one.